All right, good afternoon or good late early morning or evening to some of you, depending on where you are. This is the second to last session today. I just want to jump in and test the sound and make sure everyone can hear me okay. As usual, if you guys can just give me a thumbs up to make sure that the sound is good and that you guys can hear me, that'd be perfect. Okay, screen blinking. Is anybody else having issues with the screen? And can you guys, I just want to, again, jump in and say and ask you guys if you guys can hear us okay. If you guys can just give us a thumbs up or yes, I can hear you. Okay. All right. All right, perfect. And like I said before, if you guys haven't had a chance to do so, please feel free to answer the poll questions down at the bottom. We will really appreciate your feedback. We will get started here in about a minute or so. I just want to give enough time for people coming from the last session to come over before we get started. But in the interlude of that, if you guys have any issues with your sound, the screen, please put that into the chat and we'll try to get you guys all squared away. And like I said, we'll get started here in maybe we'll give it about another extra minute or so, just to get other people who are coming from the last session a chance to get in.
Hey, Karen, I have a quick question. This is Paul. I'm just gonna pull the Crowdcast window. How do I get rid of this so that I can see the chat? This panel right here.
Okay, so you would have to kind of like zoom out of your screen. I think you have your screen full screen.
No, that would be full screen right there. It's just this panel right here I'm trying to get rid of so that I can see the chat.
Oh, the top panel. So click the little eye over there in the left-hand corner.
The left-hand corner right there.
Because you're on the drop-down menu. Okay, so right where it says, underneath that eye where it says Paul Turley and it says less, hit the less button.
Less, I'm sorry.
Over there, right where your session title is, where you see creating and right next to your name.
Yeah, okay. I'll pull
there
that up to another screen. Oops. Weird stuff going on here.
Ooh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, all right. I want to pull it onto another screen. Oh. Let's go there. Okay, there we go. And I can put that up here. Now I can see the chat window. Awesome.
All right.
Let's dismiss all my reminders now.
All right, like I said, we'll give it about another minute. Okay, we'll get started here right at 3:02, just to give some people some time. I see a lot of people flooding in from the last session.
$648 people. That's pretty cool.
Yep. Still waiting for some. I'm assuming the last session is still probably going on. For those of you who are just not joining, or if this is your first live session for the day, if you guys hadn't had a chance to answer the poll questions, please feel free to do so. And like I said before, and like you guys may have already know, please, if you guys have any issues with the sound or your screen, please put that into the chat and we'll try to get you squared away. And it's about 3:02 right now, so I'm gonna go ahead and let Paul go ahead and take over. And I'm assuming the rest of the people will join after the last session ends.
All right. Well, thank you, Karen. Let me just clear my screen here a bit. Appreciate everybody joining today. It's an exciting event. We've had really, really great attendance, and we appreciate that. There's obviously a lot of interest in these topics, and particularly Azure Cloud Solutions. And something that is near and dear to me, that's business intelligence. So we're going to talk about Power BI, and particularly creating scalable Power BI solutions. And I've subtitled my presentation "Good and Best Practices." We'll talk about why we'll talk about good practices as opposed to just best practices. But my name is Paul Turley. I am a principal consultant with Pragmatic Works, and I've been in the industry for a good 20 years or so, kind of depending on what you count, but around the Microsoft data platform, data warehousing, business intelligence. And I started out using, after SQL Server and tools like Access and Office VBA, I started getting serious about building data warehouse solutions, and then started using SQL Server reporting services, analysis services, integration services, and then kind of grew up through the self-service BI part of that product stack, and have been using Power BI since it's been called Power BI, and some of the technologies and products that evolved into what we call Power BI today. And I love BI. You're going to get that from me. I'm very, very passionate about the work that we do. So I'm not going to read this slide, but this is what we promised to talk about today. And so this is my agenda as we work through these topics. Because we're talking about scalable solutions, I wanted to define what we mean by scale. So when we think about scalable solutions, there are three words that are very commonly used to define scale. And they're probably words that you're very familiar with: volume, velocity, and variety. And so I'm going to define those words and how they contribute to this topic. But I've added a couple of other words that I think kind of categorize scalable solutions around business intelligence. And they are understanding your audience and the maintainability of a solution. So what do I mean by volume, velocity, variety, audience, and maintainability? So when we think about volume, this is one of the first questions that I typically ask a consulting customer when we're talking about architecting and designing a business intelligence solution: is how many rows of data are we talking about? How big is that data? What is the volume of that data? There are a few different ways that we can measure that. Row count is probably the most convenient. We think about storage size on disk, and honestly, with the data modeling technologies used in Power BI, we don't really care so much about on-disk storage, but we do care a lot about how much memory that takes. So that's just categorically what we think about when we talk about volume. And if you're in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of row count, that's small data. When we talk about tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of rows, that's typically what we think of as high volume data. Velocity: how often does new data get introduced in the data sources, and how often will it need to be brought into a data model for reporting? And how often does data change? Are we just adding new records as time goes on, or do existing records change? Do we have changing dimensions? Do we need to track those changes over time? And that's one of the things that we think about in terms of velocity. And how often do users need to see that data change? I find often when having this conversation with new customers, when I say, well, how frequently do you want to see changes? Sometimes the knee-jerk answer is, oh, well, real time. We want to see it as it changes. And sometimes that's not appropriate, and sometimes it's just not necessary. But as data changes, we may refresh data overnight. It may just be once a week, or it could be a couple of times during the day. And the variety of data, different kinds of data sources. Power BI is a tool that easily gives us access to data in a lot of different forms from a lot of different data sources. And quite honestly, when we build larger scale solutions, typically the variety of data that we deal with in a tool like Power BI or analysis services goes down because we tend to do dimensional modeling in a relational database using kind of a traditional data warehouse approach. But that doesn't mean we have to do that. But that's kind of been my experience, is that we may be talking about the variety of data coming into our data mart, coming into our data lake, coming into our data warehouse that's managed through our ETL process. And then finally, the audience, the number of users, and within that body of users, how many of them are viewers, will just view ready-made reports, or maybe interact with those reports, since Power BI gives us very interactive reports that give us things like drill through and visual interactions. How many of them are authors? And we can kind of subcategorize authors as, one, users who might change a visual, might do a little bit of data discovery using some simple features within Power BI, versus those who will actually start over again, maybe from a data set, will author their own reports and really have an appetite for doing kind of deep report authoring and even data mashups and modeling their own data. And I think that those authors tend to fit into the analyst category. Without going too deep, kind of categorize that audience in terms of viewers, authors, and analysts. And then finally, the maintainability of the solution. How do we manage enhancements? Handoff from one developer to another. If I'm coming in as a consultant, I'm not going to be in that organization forever. And so we need to plan a transition to a team of developers to another developer. As one developer rolls off and hands off to another, how do we collaborate? How do we manage versions? How do we, how do those files trade hands? And then how do we manage deployment? So these are the things that I think about in terms of scale as we think about a solution. So I want to step back just a little bit, because a lot of this material is actually taken from a series of blog posts that I put together. It kind of evolved into a white paper. And that is a bit of a living document for a couple of reasons. One is that Power BI is a tool that, one, we have some very solid best practices around using, and two, we have some practices that are kind of preferential. Things that I do that work for me may not necessarily work for you. You will find a variety of recommended practices within the industry. As you look for help, as you seek support and kind of, seek best practices, you'll find that different people have different ways of doing things. So this is very much kind of a living organism that we're working with that tends to evolve. We discover new techniques, we develop new best practices as we go, and the product is moving very quickly. So this series of blog posts and my white paper, which you can find here on my blog, is very much a living document, and I'm always doing correction and kind of evolving and tuning and making adjustments to that as we go. That is the nature of the tools that we're working with. I'll have that on my resource slide at the end, and you'll have access to these slides. So bad, good, and best. I wanted to make a point of talking about bad, good, and best because Power BI, like a lot of self-service BI tools, is not a tool that we can say, always do exactly this and everything will go well. It's a little more vague sometimes than that, but I just wanted to kind of categorize what I mean by a bad practice, a good practice, and a best practice. Some of this may be self-evident and pretty obvious, but I think it's worth pointing out that a bad practice is something that you just shouldn't do. It'll have a negative outcome. And typically we can point to a bad practice to say, well, don't do that because there is a best practice. Okay. Through our experience, we have learned that there are techniques that you should always exercise. Therefore, do that rather than the bad practice. But these are tools that give us a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of latitude to be creative, and it's easy to make mistakes. What's a good practice? Well, this is a category that I think is important to understand because of the latitude that we have in using Power BI to do things in a very creative way. Sometimes we can do things quickly that may not necessarily be scalable. Sometimes we have a lot of choices, and there's a lot of it depends to the way you should design and build things depending on your needs. And I'm going to break that down and talk about that using specific examples. And best practices, generally a best practice is when clearly a technique is the best choice. The technique or the feature is well understood, it's accepted in the industry, people agree, they promote it, it's documented, Microsoft will stand behind it. We in the industry who are practitioners of these tools will stand behind it because we have a lot of experience. So always do that for the best outcome. So let's back up and talk about how this applies to projects. As I think about Power BI projects, there are really two solid categories of different project types. There are formal projects, and I come from an IT background. I come from a very formal, IT-based background where in the past solutions were always developed using a very strong methodology and discipline. And generally when business users needed reports and needed analytics, they came to IT. And so we typically think of formal projects as those that are scoped, funded, staffed, executed with a business champion and an IT champion. There's stakeholders on both sides. There's management on both sides. And, it's a very formal kind of disciplined environment. A lot of BI isn't that way these days. And that brings us to informal projects. Why not always manage projects in a very formal, very disciplined way? Because it's time consuming and it's costly. Power BI is an excellent self-service tool. It allows practitioners who might be less skilled, but I just don't want to categorize ad hoc analysts as less skilled. These are people who just need to get things done. They just need access to data. They need to build reports. They need to analyze that data quickly and without a lot of overhead and necessarily without exercising a lot of formality. And so there's a good use case for simple, quick, informal projects. But typically we design those projects, we design those solutions a little bit differently. Data sets are generally not IT governed. Reports are typically not certified. The data may be sloppy. There may be data quality issues. And if 95% of our data is good and the reports are 95% trustworthy and reliable, well, we've accomplished something, though it may not be perfect. And then there's this gray space in between that we might call hybrid projects. And I think most of our projects kind of fit into this hybrid area, which could be anything in between formal and informal projects. So on that same theme, when we think about the solution architecture of any business intelligence project, creating with any set of tools, we're always going to have source queries. We're always going to have data transformation steps. That could be an ETL or an ELT process where we source data, we cleanse it, we shape it, and we pound it into the right shape so that that data can then exist within a semantic data model. The whole concept of a semantic data model is core to Microsoft's vision for business intelligence. There has always been a semantic data model. We used to call it OLAP. We refer to it as multidimensional, as cubes. In more modern instances, we think about this as an in-memory tabular model, which is what Power BI is based on. The semantic model is the heartbeat, it's the core of your solution. Calculations, typically measures, and then data visualizations, which in the Power BI world are reports. Reports have pages, and then you can pin visuals from those reports or perhaps an entire report page onto a dashboard. The term dashboard is a bit nebulous, I think, in the BI world, and oftentimes business users refer to reports as dashboard, maybe dashboard style reports. I've learned not to overcorrect users when it comes to talking about dashboards, just because Microsoft chose to build this thing called the dashboard that's part of Power BI. that's sometimes that's just used to describe kind of a visual, very visual, summarized type of report with KPI tiles and that kind of thing. But within the Power BI platform, we can kind of think about the whole opportunity to implement all of these things. A user can download Power BI Desktop for free. They can set up an account for free. They can publish for their own consumption for free. And then they can share reports via web sharing, which is not entirely secure, for free. When they need to share with others securely, that's when Microsoft starts charging for the product through pro licensing. For every user, it's $10 US per month. You can share with a small group that's cost effective, up to dozens or maybe even hundreds of users. It's simple, it's easy to get started. It's fairly inexpensive until you get up into the several hundred or thousands of users, when premium capacity licensing becomes more cost effective and more attractive. But with premium comes a whole bunch of features, and I don't want to take a lot of time to get into that. But then we also have features laid on top of these things, like the embedding service, which would allow a company to integrate Power BI visuals and reports and dashboards into custom applications with their own brand and their own styling. B2B sharing, which is offered through Azure. And then composite models, aggregations, very large scale data models have support, which requires premium capacity features. Now, the reason that I mention this is kind of the foundation for the rest of my discussion. So I'm going to step back. Here's an idea. Let's just start with an informal self-service BI project and let it evolve into a formal enterprise scale project. And tongue-in-cheek, I say that this is a quote from every inexperienced Power BI user. This is how a lot of BI projects come to be. This is how they evolve. And the idea is, well, we don't really understand all of our requirements. We're just going to throw data together and model it and kind of, let it grow organically and see what happens. And then eventually we'll roll it out to the masses. It's not the way things work. Here's a better idea. Let's let the business create an informal self-service BI project. Use it as a working prototype and then start over. I want to underline, start over, applying manageable best practice design. As I work with consulting clients, as you can understand, there is some resistance to this idea of starting over, throwing something away, backing up the bus, losing in any of the assets that we've created. But it's a pattern that works, and it's a pattern that's efficient and saves time and money in the long run. And tongue-in-cheek, I'm going to say that this is a quote from seasoned BI practitioners who have done this before. And I like the question, but it's better, or the comment, better than waiting 6 months for the IT solution. Yes, absolutely. And that's what self-service is all about. And, getting to the right scalable solution is often a bit of a negotiation between self-service, just getting it done, and, applying the discipline that's necessary to really build manageable projects. It's always a negotiation. All right. So when we think about volume, it brings us back to kind of thinking about where we transform our data and how we best optimize the consumption of that data. You really have three different opportunities to transform and shape data. One is at the data source. So in the SQL query, in the view, in the file, whatever your data source is, you can shape and optimize that data before it lands inside Power BI. Secondly, you can do that within Power Query, utilizing the query editor, which builds M code. And to some degree, you can shape and transform that data using calculated columns and using calculated tables within DAX, within the data model itself. So these are my best practice recommendations. Avoid using SQL statements in Power Queries. Use database views. Now, My experience with this, I actually presented this at an event up in Vancouver, BC. I guess it was week before last now. And I said this and jaws dropped. And I had hardcore SQL Server database people say, wait. No, we solve the world's problems through SQL. And so we write inline SQL statements. Don't do that. Don't do that in Power BI. Build database views. And the reason for that is that Power Query needs to fold that query. It needs to be able to transform it into a SQL query that SQL Server can run, or Oracle can run, or Teradata can run, rather than having to pull all of that data into memory and manipulate it within Power Query. Build views. I can't emphasize that enough. Remove unnecessary columns and filter rows early in the query. Consolidate field renaming, removing fields, and data type changes. Put all of those into as few steps as possible within Power Query. So don't rename a column, change its data type, rename another column, change its data type, etc., and build a whole bunch of transformation steps. Try to do them all in one step. Rename all your columns, change all your data types. Add custom columns in Power Query instead of DAX. Now, if you go to the Italian site, you know, where they're kind of all about DAX, and those guys are really smart. I don't mean to suggest that you're going to get any bad advice there. But when you talk to somebody who thinks in DAX, they're going to say, hey, let me show you how to do that in DAX. And if you Google, how do I concatenate values together to create a calculated column, or, you know, you're going to find examples in DAX, because Power Pivot evolved before Power Query. Yet Power Query can be a stronger tool for doing transformations and row-by-row calculations rather than DAX. All right, and then rename steps and add annotations in your M code. Make it readable so that when you transition to somebody else, they can go look at that code and they can see what was going on. Managing dataset size with parameters. Now, if you are a premium capacity customer, then you can use incremental refresh, which is an awesome feature for large volume data. If you are not a premium capacity customer, do this anyway. In every one of your queries over a very large table, typically a fact table, define two parameters, one called range start, one called range end. Make them date time, and go look up how to implement incremental refresh. That's where these screenshots are taken from. And then apply a range filter that allows you to restrict the data based on a date range. If you'll do that, then very simply, you can use those parameters to say, I only want to load 1 year's worth of data. And let me show you an example of where I've done this. And I just realized I rebooted just before this because I was having some problems with PowerPoint and I didn't open up my Power BI file. So bear with me just a minute. In fact, let me do it this way. So since this file will take a minute or so to load, I'm just going to let it do that on another screen and I'll come back to it rather than waiting for it. Just so you can see what I'm seeing, I'm waiting for Power BI Desktop to load. Just want to choose my file here real quick. It's right there. And then I'll switch back to my presentation. All right, we'll come back and take a look at parameters. This I lifted right out of that blog post that I mentioned. These are a couple of previous blog posts where I've talked about building high-scale Power BI solutions. Again, this will be on the summary slide at the end of this presentation, but you can find my blog at sqlserverbi.blog, and you'll find a lot of posts about my recommended best practices, and particularly building scalable solutions with Power BI. Okay, variety and velocity. It'll be like my graphic here for variety and velocity. High velocity. Apply dimensional design. I can't stress this enough. It is absolutely important that your data is shaped so that it supports your reporting experience. If you are not versed in dimensional design, the concepts, the religion of dimensional design, building star schemas, I strongly recommend that you pick up, or at least go to the Kimball Group website and read about how to build star schemas. Ralph Kimball and his consulting group have been shut down for a couple of years now, but they spent 30 years promoting dimensional design. And in my opinion, the Kimball Group's books, which live today and continue to get updated, are the Bible of dimensional design. And it's absolutely critical to understanding how to use Power BI efficiently. We could spend a couple of weeks talking about dimensional design. Enforce dimension key uniqueness. So when you're designing a data model, in order to build relationships, those relationships are going to be one-to-many generally. There is a many-to-many use case, but it's very, very rare. So on the one side of that relationship, you can go set a property on that column to enforce uniqueness, which will cause an error if there's a duplicate value. You can also force unique values within Power Query. And I recommend that you do that. I recommend that you let your data refresh in Power Query fail if you have duplicate keys that you didn't anticipate because of data quality issues. Never ever assume that you're always going to have unique values unless that's enforced in your data warehouse. Avoid bidirectional filters and unnecessary bridging tables. Sometimes they can't be avoided, but through iterative smart design, you can get rid of those bidirectional filters and speed up your data models quite a bit. I believe in creating calculated columns in Power Query wherever possible and not in DAX. That's not to say that I don't use DAX to create calculated columns in some cases. But as I mentioned, Power Pivot evolved before Power Query. Therefore, it became a common practice to create calculated columns in a tabular data model. And oftentimes that can be avoided. The use case there is that when it's a row level value, I'm just concatenating first name with last name to creating full name, or taking quantity times unit price and putting them together to do extended total amount. That if that kind of thing can be done row by row, do those calculations within Power Query. Annotate your code. I mentioned this before. 6 months from now, you're going to go back and you're going to look at your code. You should be able to read it. Okay. Think about somebody else, a junior level person coming in and looking at your project. Are they going to understand what's going on? You're in the moment, at the time designing this thing. Of course you get it. You understand it. Everything's obvious to you. But you need to comment your code. And you can do that in Power Query by opening up the advanced editor. You can add comments there. You can add descriptions to your transformation steps. You can comment your DAX code when you create measures, // double hyphen. Hide all fields that are not used directly by users. Remember that when you're creating a data model, you are crafting a user experience. And the key word there is user. If you're a database professional, you're used to camel case, Pascal case, things shoved together. That's okay in a database. But in Power BI, everything that a user sees should be friendly, inviting, sentence case, uppercase, lowercase, spaces, uppercase, lowercase. Make it readable, make it friendly, make it simple. And anything that users don't need to use, keys, columns that are just there for sorting purposes, hide all of those things. And set any numeric columns that are not used for measures, not used for aggregation, set them to do not summarize. Now, if you're going to hide those columns, then you don't necessarily need to go through that exercise. But, I'm a little OCD, and so I spend a lot of time with these things, making sure that they're very clean, very neat. Okay, I'm going to open up this whole slide and just talk through it briefly, because this is an important point. If you're building a simple ad hoc solution, it's more convenient to open up Power BI Desktop, import your data, build a data model, add your measures, and then build reports right there in one PBIX file. It's less convenient to publish that as a data set and then open up another Power BI desktop instance, connect to that published data set, and build new reports. However, when you do that, it gives you separation of work. It allows one developer to manage the data model and another developer to build reports. It allows you to create multiple reports against a single data model. So there are trade-offs here, but we now have the ability to publish a PBIX and not necessarily add visuals to it. And then you can use that as a data source to create reports in a separate file, which is a lot like the way that we use analysis services to design our data models and then build reports that point to those analysis services models. So in an IT managed, fully scaled out solution, this is typically where I go. Now, to the point of, do I use analysis services or do I use Power BI to do my data modeling? This is an arguable point. And without reading through this slide, let me just summarize it. Microsoft are putting most of their resources into enhancing and supporting Power BI rather than analysis services. Now, that doesn't mean that analysis services is going to die. We know that multidimensional is not going to die, but we're probably not going to see a lot of enhancement into that, the multidimensional or cube-based analysis services. Analysis services tabular, that has a bright future. You build those solutions in Visual Studio. That design environment is more cumbersome. It's not as stable. It's not as reliable, simply because the audience for that type of solution is not as big as Power BI. So Microsoft is putting their resources where they're seeing the most use, and that's Power BI. A lot of enterprise features are now going into Power BI desktop and Power BI premium capacity. So my default thought about where do I model my data is to use Power BI desktop first, unless there's a real strong argument for using analysis services instead. And by analysis services, that could mean I deploy analysis services on-prem and use a gateway up to Power BI, or I use Azure Analysis Services. That's what AAS means there. And there are good reasons for doing that. However, understand that using Power BI to manage data sets with premium capacity gives you access to some very, very scalable large volume solutions. You can have data models that are up to 12 gigabytes in size of compressed data. And that's a lot of data. But if you have huge volumes of data, that you may need to use AAS or SSAS. All right, I'm going to look at your questions here real quick. This is a good pause point. So the point of user tables here is that Power Query and DAX can do a lot. Yeah, so Power Query in particular, DAX doesn't go query folding. Power Query does query folding. And Andrew, you're absolutely right that understanding query folding is really important to building high scale and efficient models. And the whole idea behind query folding is that the stuff that you do in Power Query gets translated into a query that's processed at your database server, not within Power Query. So, it gets turned into a T-SQL query that SQL Server or Teradata processes. It gets turned into a PL SQL query that Oracle processes. Understand that. Do you anticipate a certified data set having the ability to combine with other data sets? John, that's an excellent question. I can tell you that I know that the product team is working on that very hard. I have not seen, I've not personally seen traction around that yet. Yet I know that it's a big ask. It's a hard thing to do, but the idea of having an established data model that you can then connect to and then add additional tables to in another data model is pretty compelling. And I'd love to see it. And I know that Microsoft are working on that or something like that. There are no specific promises, though. And Donald, if you can't use query folding, then I use custom SQL with parameters to reduce data size. Yeah, Donald, I think that's probably probably a good pattern to follow. But I would put all of your effort into getting query folding to work and thinking about using views first. And if you can't, then there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I will add that using a table valued user defined function is an option. You can parameterize that. Though it's not nearly as mainstream as kind of using Power Query out of the box against tables or views. And I've not had a real good experience. Sorry for the pop-up there. I need to turn those off. Not had a real good experience using stored procedures in Power Query. It can be done, and I've done it. I have clients who do it, but it's not the go-to best practice. Okay. So Heinrich, I guess it's Angela. I don't fully understand your question, but if you'd just like to post a question, I'd be happy to answer it as time allows. Okay, promote self-service reporting. This is a really important topic, and I'm reminded that I wanted to go back and show you a quick demonstration that I needed to prepare for. So let me just open this up real quickly. Here in Power BI Desktop, I have applied that pattern that I talked about earlier using parameters. So if we go back and I'm going to open up the query here, you'll see that I have my range start and my range end parameter. The reason that I named those parameters and the reason they're date time parameters is that these are the requirements of the incremental refresh feature of Power BI. Now you have to have a premium capacity tenant to be able to use incremental refresh. But even if you don't, I follow the same pattern. So one, if I do end up graduating to premium, I'm ready to implement it. But if I don't, I have this well-established pattern of I was playing with composite queries here, and that's why you're seeing a duplicate copy. I've got an import copy of store sales and a direct query copy. But here you can see that I've added this step where I've used those parameters to do a range filter. And all I'm doing is saying, I have a column, and it has to be a date time column. And the database professional in me says, wait a second, if I've got a date type, why would I want to make it a date time type? And the answer is because that's the way this feature works. And so, you could argue that date time is not quite as efficient as date, but you know what? That's the way this feature works. So that's what I'm following directions here. So that column value is after or equal to range start and is before range end. The thing that's not real intuitive here is that range end value should actually be January 1st of 2010, not December 31st of 2009, because it has to be is before. And again, it's just the way that they decided to design the incremental refresh. So if I go back to my table in the model here, assuming that I am pointed to a premium tenant, I can turn on incremental refresh. And I'm going to say, all right, I want 12 years worth of data, and I always want to refresh the last year. So once I publish this to the service, first of all, because I only had 1 year of data, you can see that I've only imported 1 year of data. That keeps my PBIX file small, makes it easy to deploy. And then when I go out to the service, here, oops, jump over here. That's showing up on another window. You can see that I've scheduled refresh through my gateway, and I actually have 3 years worth of data. So this just shows that I have more data online. This might be, over a gigabyte of data, which I can't publish to a non-premium subscription, and having a gigabyte or a 2 gigabyte data model would be very, very slow and cumbersome to process. All right. It's a simple pattern, but it will solve a lot of problems if you do that. Promote self-service reporting. Even with consulting clients where we're working in an environment where users are just used to going and looking at reports or printing reports, we still want to promote self-service. All right, we want to help users understand that they can go do their own reporting against published data models. So self-service reporting, kind of promotes this idea that users can go get their own data and mash it up, and that data is not going to be governed. It may not necessarily be signed off or certified. So you can teach and support analyst users to use Power BI to acquire, mash up, and model their own data. I like this quote, and if you have kids as old as mine, you might recognize this from the Magic School Bus. Excuse the cultural reference there if that's not something that is part of your history. But in this educational cartoon series, Lily Tomlin played the bus driver, Ms. Frizzle, and the teacher, and she said, "Make mistakes, get messy." In other words, go out and try stuff, and if it doesn't work, then try something else. And as long as it's not dangerous or life-threatening, that's a good pattern to follow. And that's really what self-service is all about. Be prepared to start over again. And so don't invest too much in your mistakes. Deploy to a user-designated workspace. So that way we know that all of the stuff in this workspace is experimental, or it's evolving, it's iterative, and all of the stuff in another workspace might be certified and sanctioned by the business and by IT. User-authored solutions can be used to prototype and can be patterned to create governed data models. So governed data, I'm trying to be mindful of time here. Governed data, typically we want to separate data sets from reports. Think about it more like the way that we would use analysis services to build data models, then build reports separately on top of that. Publish to a secured and managed workspace rather than just democratizing everything and letting users publish along with the certified data sets. Promote and certify data sets. So within Power BI premium capacity, we now have the promoted and certified data sets feature, which means that users in a certain Azure Active Directory group have the ability to go tag a data set as promoted or certified. And that just simply means they're putting their blessing on it, and they're saying, this has gone through a process that we define within our business, and I'm going to mark that data set as we bought off on that, and we believe that that's reliable, it's certified, it's governed. There are also features within Power BI service that allow us to certify and govern the structure of the data. Things like data flows and standardized common data models that are part of the CDM. Enable users to connect to published data sets and create their own reports, and teach them to do that. So this is certified in shared data sets. It's a very simple feature, but it's something that you have to turn on in your tenant, and then you add an AAD group that says any users in this group can promote and can certify data sets. I talk to business users all the time who say, hey, can you build me a report that looks like Excel? Or you've built this fancy visual report, show me how I can export it to Excel so that I can make a copy on my desktop, so that I can email it around to my friends. Don't do that. If users need Excel, teach them to use Excel with Power BI. Don't export, connect to a single version of the truth. Keep the data model within the service and use the Analyze in Excel feature to allow Excel to connect to that published data model. Analyze in Excel is a simple feature. It's easy to use, and it's a golden nugget. It's a gem that a lot of people really don't know about, and it can really be a game-changing feature when financial users, people who eat, sleep, and breathe Excel, come to realize that they don't have to have their cheese moved to where all of the reports look like your typical Power BI report, that they can continue to use, whether it's pivot tables with filters and slicers, or it's cube functions, or other stuff that they already know how to use in Excel, can be used within a tool that they already know and love and is native for them. So use Excel with Power BI. There's all kinds of training and reference material and stuff out there that can show you how to do that. And I'm kind of excited that now free users with a premium tenant license can use Analyze in Excel. It used to be that you had to have a pro license to use Analyze in Excel. But it's just a screenshot of a pivot table in Excel with the typical field list experience over on the right side. But here I am connected to a published data set hosted in the Power BI service. I'm not copying data to my desktop. I'm connecting to live data, and that data is going to get refreshed every night. And if I save a copy of this workbook, unless I, Control C, Control V, and copy it into another workbook, there's only a cached copy of this data that gets refreshed every time I open it. All right. And then finally, maintainability. How do you manage Power BI desktop files? And we're getting into that gray space of where we have some best practices, but we also have just some good practices and some techniques that kind of evolved through the community, because Power BI started as a self-service tool, and now it's evolving into the enterprise space. So how do you manage Power BI desktop files? And I see that there are questions popping up, and I can only multitask so much. So I'm going to try to make sure that I have a little bit of time at the end to answer your questions, maybe 5 minutes or so. So, the answer is pretty simple here. So Power BI Desktop builds a PBIX file. You really can't crack open that file. You can't put it into version control and tease it apart. Many have tried and it doesn't work. Just understand that it is pretty much a black box. But store that file in a centrally managed network accessible folder. It could be in OneDrive, it could be Dropbox, it could be in SharePoint, but you need to sync that with your local file system. Do not open PBIX files from the web. Don't open them from your SharePoint portal. Synchronize that library with your desktop and then work with it locally. That's the way that Power BI wants to work. Typically, a manageable PBIX file is going to be in the range of a couple hundred megabytes in size. If you get up into the 500 megabyte, 600 megabyte range, start using parameters to limit the load of data into your PBIX files using the technique that I showed you before, so that you're not trying to publish big files up to the service. Publish smaller files into the service, then you can change parameters in the service or use incremental refresh, which builds partitions, and then let your data get refreshed up in the service rather than trying to publish, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte files. Lots of options here. Just know that there's very limited opportunity to use, GitHub, VSTS, or other version control solutions. Microsoft are working on an ALM toolkit for Power BI. The timeline for that is vague, and it's probably not going to integrate with other build and version management tools that you have. Just understand that that's the way things are. This is a technique, and I'm going to point you to my blog so that I can start taking questions, but this is a technique that I promote to manage versions. It's not rocket science. One, postfix file names with a version. I typically use a 3-part version, major, minor, revision, and save off archived copies of older files so that you can go back and, hey, this used to work and we broke it. And so you can go back and go look at that measure before you quote unquote fixed it. But what I do is I actually use Power Query to create a table. I use the enter data feature to add rows to that table with the new version, my name, and an annotation, a revision note. And then I create a simple measure to return that, and so that I can put it onto a report that says this data was last refreshed on this date, and this is the current version number. So again, I'm going to point you to my blog. I've got some other material here. I will point out that in a simple ad hoc data model, there's nothing wrong with using implicit measures. And what that means is a numeric column that we say, when we drag and drop this into a visual, it gets summed or it gets averaged or it gets counted. In larger scale, scalable models don't do that. I hide all my numeric columns and I create measures that are postfixed with total, sum, average, or something more complex than that. There are a lot of good reasons for that. We don't have a lot of time to get into that discussion, but explicit measures are the way to go. Even though Power BI kind of promotes this self-service idea that you can just use numeric columns like we do in Excel, just understand that there are limitations and good reasons not to do that. Okay. I'll just end with this checklist. You'll find this on my blog, and this was kind of lifted out of that kind of white paper post I did about good and best practices. So let's go back to your questions. I'm going to scroll back up here. All right, so Angela, we have a data set of 70 gigabytes containing data over the last 20 years, 30,000 transactions every day. Okay, so this is big. You've got high volume data, you have high velocity data. Obviously, it doesn't perform well on a broad time range. Power BI would probably do great for management reports, but how would you recommend it for detailed reports? I happen to be on the slide that answers your questions. Thank you so much. It's interesting that with a really well-tuned data model, you can actually do quite a bit of detail and transactional reporting in Power BI. However, we're really pushing the envelope. So one, if Power BI is the right tool, and it may not be the right tool in all use cases, but if Power BI is the right tool to manage that kind of volume, and I've built Power BI data models with hundreds of millions or billions of rows of data in the largest tables, and tuned it to work really well. Got the data to compress efficiently and kept the size down, and performance was good. Use features like drill through so that you're not running big queries on every page. So keep, those summary pages, keep them simple so that they perform well. Use right-click drill through into your detail pages so that they're filtered and you're always looking at a subset of your data. When we're thinking about real operational reports, reporting services is a better tool for that kind of thing. We now call that paginated reports. And if you're in premium, you now have paginated reports, which is really SQL Server reporting services in the Power BI service. And there are a lot of use cases where it just makes more sense to build a paginated report. And we can use creative techniques to drill through from a Power BI report into a paginated report using parameters, and even go the other direction as well. So, short answer to what could be, a very complex topic. But Angela, my answer is it depends. But Power BI, might be able to handle what you're throwing at it. But you should also think about perhaps using paginated reports. Okay, ask a question. All right, I see that. So got to go. Thanks. Thank you very much, Donald. So what is your opinion of Power BI data flows, especially with premium? And I saw that Donald had to run, but I'll answer the question. Yeah, data flows have a great use case, but it's not a replacement for a lot of the data modeling that we just simply do in Power BI Desktop. When you have standard schemas, if you're working with the common data model with Microsoft Dynamics, for example, it makes sense to have a definition of a customer that's always the same. Data flows are really good at that kind of thing. I don't think data flows solve all the problems, and they're good use cases, but you don't have to use data flows. Do you anticipate a certified data set having the ability to combine with other data sets? I did answer this question earlier. I think we'd all like to see that. I know the product team is working on it, but no promises. We have quite a few users that access tabular cubes via Excel. I don't want to be nitpicky, but cubes are multidimensional, tabular are data models, but I understand what you mean. You talked a lot about Power BI instead of SSAS. Excel works great against SSAS in exactly the same way that it works against Power BI. Understand that the data modeling engine behind Power BI, both in desktop and in the service, is in fact Analysis Services Tabular. There are some feature differences between the products, but it's exactly the same technology. In technical terms, we call it Vertipack and Vertiscan, but it's the same thing. I prefer to think about using Power BI in place of SSAS where possible, but SSAS still has a place in the world. We have a data set of, okay, and you asked the same question there, Angela. Thank you for that. How to handle multiple facts with conformed dimensions in Power BI. Boy, that is a big question, and I'm going to point you back to dimensional modeling. Understand the tenets of dimensional modeling. There is no way that I can answer this question in a few minutes, but they're very mainstream best practices for organizing data into multiple fact tables that have common conformed dimensions. And that's what dimensional modeling and star schemas are all about. So get good at that. There are good books on that, starting with the Data Warehouse Toolkit from Ralph Kimball. When using import method with a very large data volume in Power BI, does the refresh data set time depend on the data source performance? It certainly does, but incremental refresh will speed that up because it creates partitions. That's my simple answer to what could be a deeper discussion. Can you accomplish incremental refresh using 2 data flows, once for archive partition? I think the answer to your question is no, Michael. Data flows and incremental refresh are really 2 different things. Don't think about data flows as data sources. Think about them as schema definitions. We still have data models that are based on the tables that are derived from data flows. What's the best way to implement multi-environment like dev, test, and prod versions? Go back and look at my blog where I talk about this in greater depth. We're going to categorize this as a good practice because there aren't really hardcore best practices around that. But there is a white paper published by Microsoft. It was written by Chris Webb and Melissa Coates, managing large-scale premium capacity solutions, that talks more about managing an application lifecycle cadence and some techniques you can use to use PowerShell to migrate between dev, test, and prod. And this will have to be the last question. Paginated reports. Have you used Power BI Report Builder? And if so, is it comparable to SSRS? It is exactly the same as SSRS, Victoria. Paginated reports is Microsoft's new brand term for SQL Server reporting services. As it's hosted in the Power BI service, it is SQL Server reporting services. Well, I said that was the last question. We have one more. Is incremental data refresh possible with an Azure tabular model? The incremental data refresh is a feature of Power BI that builds partitions in exactly the same way that we would under the covers, under the hood, within an analysis services data model, which could be hosted in Azure. And so I'm going to give you the simple answer of yes, it's the same thing. The more complicated answer is that there are two different techniques and approaches to getting to the same place. So with that, we're 3 minutes over, and I'm going to go ahead and just get to the wrap-up slide, and thank you for your time. And so thank you. This is how you can contact me. Everything that you've just seen in greater detail, you'll find on my blog, SQL Server BI blog, and really appreciate you attending for your time and your attention.
All right. Thank you, Paul. We really appreciate it. And if you guys are interested in going on to the next session, please just go up in your left-hand corner and click the drop-down menu. Will take you to the next session. But if you guys have any questions, like Paul said, please feel free to reach out to Paul or myself. We'll be happy to help. Thank you, guys. I saw there was tons of questions, so I appreciate that. And Paul, thank you so much again for hosting this session. We appreciate it.
Thank you for moderating.
No problem. And if you guys want to get the recording to the session, please just give it about 5 minutes, and then you guys can come back to the session and rewatch it and replay as many times as you guys want. Thank you guys so much for joining, and I hope you guys enjoyed the last session of the day and the rest of your Azure Data Week. Bye-bye.